Hello, everyone. I am once again running late. I feel that maybe we should be having an hour window from 4 to 5 for these. So, all right, it's signed on now. So I'm coming to you to talk about The Body Keeps the Score. We are in chapters 5 and 6. And I think next week we might actually aim for more of a 5 o'clock time, actually Thursday going forward, because that seems to be working better with our parenting, schooling rhythm. After the kids have had a snack, they seem to leave mommy alone. We'll see if that happens today. All right, so here we go. Lots of people sent in questions and quotes and really interacted with these two chapters a lot. I'm really grateful for that because I found that I was more deeply engaged with these two chapters. It seems like each chapter kind of pulls me deeper in. Um, and I just found it really fascinating and realized that I read it a lot slower than I intended to because I was just so like enamored by it. I would read something and then kind of stop because I found myself reflecting on, you know, my own experiences and people in my family experience and hey Diane and people I know's experience and wondering I wonder if that's what I'm seeing. So I wonder if you kind of experience that too, that you read something and step back and go, whoa, that makes sense. Um, so, all right, I see some of you signing on. I'm just rambling for a couple seconds while you get here. All right. I can't promise that there won't be a 4-year-old coming into the room at some point. So we'll see. All right, so the chapter 5 was on body brain connections. And he starts out by talking about Darwin and how Darwin was making connections between mammals, and we're mammals, and the different things that our bodies do to express our emotions, to show how we feel, and then to show whether or not we're fighting or trying to survive or whatever. And he starts off with this lovely picture, this poor woman who I would not want to be, showing how we do with our faces what animals do when we're angry or frightened or whatever, we show expression. And it not only does it show, anger, but vulnerability or whatever. Um, and he says that Darwin on page 75 is telling us that the purpose of our emotions is to initiate a physical reaction that's meant to keep us safe and on an equilibrium. So he starts talking about how we're supposed to survive, but if we're not allowed, if our body is not allowed to do, hey Beth, what it should do, then that creates a problem. So on page 76, he says, in other words, if an organism is stuck in survival mode, its energies are focused on fighting unseen enemies, which leaves no room for nurture, care, and love. For humans, that means as long as the mind is defending itself against invisible assaults, our closest bonds are threatened, along with our ability to imagine, play, learn, and pay attention to other people's needs. I feel like those couple sentences could really summarize these two chapters. If we have been traumatized and we're stuck in that mode of trauma where we're just simply trying to survive, and survival, as he shows, can manifest itself in several ways, whether it be all the time or whether it's numbness or other responses, that keeps us from being social beings, and we are social beings. And he talks a lot about our kind of inability to function as members of a tribe, which we'll come to later. Diane had highlighted a lot of stuff about being part of a tribe. Hey, Cami. But we can't do that when we're stuck in survival and can't really feel all of the wide range of feelings and emotions. He talks about Pavlov a lot, and I think most of us are pretty familiar with the ding ding, the bell, and the salivating. I remember when I was in 3rd grade, my science teacher taught us this because those of us who are in charge of feeding the hamsters and the gerbils and all the animals, and I got to do that, We did Pavlov's experiment by ringing a bell every time we fed the animals. I don't remember what the conclusion of that was, but I'm sure it supported Pavlov's work. Um, but he talks about how it is that um, you can disassociate those things and how it's pretty difficult to disassociate, the bell and the food. So it's kind of it's hard for people to re-enter into a normal state of being after they've experienced trauma and stress. So he talks about dogs, not just about the Bell experiment, but these dogs that had been trapped in a room that had flooded. And when the danger was gone, the dogs responded in a various ways, but most of them were just immobilized. So he talks about how your the reason being is when you're traumatized or you're trapped, and we had talked about that in the previous chapters. So, for example, trigger warning: if you're raped and pinned down, or if you're a child who's experiencing trauma and you cannot leave the home, which is essentially being pinned and pinned down, how your body is wired to escape that, to fight or flight. But when you cannot do that because you're trapped by whether a real trapping or a social trapping, um, it it creates a breakdown of your equilibrium. And I got to thinking about how, so I don't know about you, but I get like serious motion sickness, like super serious. If I'm not driving, maybe I like to be in control. I don't know. If I'm not driving, I will get sick and like puke in the car. My kids are like that too. If I'm on like a boat or something and it's going like this, but my body is staying still, which is the same thing that's happening in the car, it makes me, it screws with my system. It makes me feel pukey. It makes my body shake. Um, and so, oh, and here's the 4-year-old. Say hi, mommy's friends. What's wrong? You want to show them your doll? Yeah, that's your doll. Say hi to everybody. You can stay in here with me if you close the door because it blocks all the noises out. Can you do that for me, please? Pretty please. Thank you. I love you. But it kind of made me think about that, like how our responses are messed up when we can't do what we want to do. We get stuck. And he says that people who have experienced trauma remain kind of stuck. But what I thought was really interesting was he said that some of the dogs still responded differently from one another, and that had to do with their temperament going into it, which I thought was interesting. And I would have loved to have seen the book dig a little deeper into there, because I feel like he made a statement and then you're still hungry. You can go get an apple. Okay? If you want to. I don't want an apple. Okay, I'm sorry. We're going to eat dinner soon.
No, Mommy. Can I please?
Can you please have something else?
Yeah.
You can go have pretzels, okay? See if you can find pretzels, and Mommy will help you in a few minutes, okay? Thank you. But he does say, sorry, again, with the not being able to, your body not being able to do what it wants to do, that this is exactly why people struggle when they have two opposing impulses. So people who don't leave an abusive situation, whether it be an abusive spouse or an abusive family or what have you, is because there are two things happening. Just like the dog's body wanted to move forward and could not because of the cage, your sense of desiring to be loved and held and nurtured in relationship with others is opposed to this sense of like flight. And so that sometimes that desire to remain in a relationship with people actually stops people who are being abused from leaving. And I had never thought of it like that. So, or maybe not quite in that way. All right. So he really starts talking about and keeps saying, we'll talk more in other chapters about how do we help people to re-engage with life? How do we help people feel like once that cage door is open that they can truly leave and not be stuck? Both literally, like move on with their life, and also emotionally. How can people re-experience their emotions instead of staying stuck? I'm going to hop over here to the comments. Yeah, how are we going to react when this pandemic is over? I wrote down a bunch of questions that all of you had about that we'll come to. And Rhonda says, it's true, it helps to comprehend the differences in the different reactions to trauma, what parts of the brain react to trauma and how it's different for different people. Yeah, going back to those temperaments and different things. Okay, camping out here too long. Moving on, he talks about the nervous system, and to oversimplify it, he talks about two systems, the SNS, which is the sympathetic nervous system, that's responsible for like speeding up, so that fight or flight. It's also the system that's activated when you take a deep breath. So you take a deep breath or a series of deep breaths, and it activates your heart. It activates everything. Everything's rearing and ready to go. And it functions with your emotions. So fight or flight, muscles moving, heart pumping, blood pressure up, stuff like that. And then the second branch of the ANS, or the nervous system, is the parasympathetic. So you have the sympathetic, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. And the parasympathetic is what we experience when we exhale, so everything slows down. So you have the one branch that's speeding up and the other one that's slowing down. So when you slow down, it's the things that would slow down for self-preservation. So the digestive system slowing down, or wound healing, or the heart relaxing, or the muscles relaxing, breathing slowing down. So Darwin says that our body depends on these. So feeding, shelter, and mating activities all depend on your body's ability to just slow down. And he says that this is why yoga is so helpful for victims of trauma, and why yoga in general, and I'm sure if you kind of peruse some of Hillary's yoga videos, and if you've read her book, she talks about the importance of exhaling. Exhaling as a yoga practice slows everything down and helps you get in tune with how your body feels, which is not something, as he talks about, that victims of trauma can often do. They often go numb. So, so this is going to tap in a little bit, I think, the next part, into some of the great questions that Diane had and that she highlighted. And it's how he talks about how we function as a tribe, and the way that the way we receive signals from other people teaches us, or helps us feel secure, helps us feel calm and safe and seen. And that's all because we're social, emotional creatures. We do not live in a vacuum. And Beth was talking about, I thought this was super cool. She was connecting that with something she's learning theologically in one of her EFM classes about trust. And how when we look at people and we're receiving cues from them that they are listening and they hear us and they hold us, that we then feel seen and safe, and we're able to open up and be ourselves and let our guards down and not run and not clam up. And so she was talking about the theological connections there. So I thought that was really great. And later I think he's trying to build up to talking about how do psychologists develop that kind of trust with people. How do people in a healthy relationship, or how do people in relationship with people who've been traumatized help those traumatized people to see that they are seen and they are safe and that their guards can come down. Diane was asking if if we are members of a tribe, and Cami asked this too, actually. So Diane was saying we're members of, we function as a tribe, and we can see that now, even in isolation, how we're all online trying to connect to one another. This is what we're doing right now. We already did this on the Hive for book club because we're this big group of people who can't get in a room together. But this is what everybody's doing. I mean, my kids talk to their grandma every day on Zoom because that's how they stay connected to her. But, you know, it's not physical. And so Cami was asking, how are we going to be able to physically re-enter um, that those social settings? How are we going to physically be able to re-enter our social support networks? And I think that we're seeing that now in a lot of conversations about re-entry as many states are beginning to open, and how many faith communities are looking at that, saying, okay, our communities are important, but we also want to be safe. So what do we do? And so people are scared of doing that wrong. And you know, my husband and I'd love to hear what you all think. We were talking at the beginning of this about how it might impact our kids when, you know, you're walking down the street and all of a sudden you hustle to the other side of the street, or how, you know, we're eventually going to re-enter society, but everybody's going to be wearing masks and gloves and you can't hug. And so how are we going to actually be able to do all those things again whenever we get the green light to do it? And I'd love to hear what people think. Okay. So moving on. I hear my husband. Oh, he does also talk about the how animals are helpful in reestablishing trust. So I wonder if that might even be helpful for us as we re-enter society. How people who've been traumatized often are able to connect to other mammals, like horses and dogs in particular, first. So you have like therapy and emotional support animals. Um, so, hey, thank you. Okay, now I'm less distracted because my door is closed. I'm always worried about saying something when I have the little ones over there. All right, so he talks about the levels of safety. There are 3 psychological states. So we have the first one, social engagement. So when something happens, the very first thing we do, so when we sense threat, the first thing that happens is you engage socially, okay? The second thing that happens if we call, and that just means like calling out for support, asking for help, being verbal. The second thing that we would do if that doesn't work is fight or flight. We fight, we run. And if that fails because we're held down or we're trapped, then the third thing that happens is a state of freeze or collapse. He compares this to a couple things. One, if we look at those ideas back in the very beginning when Darwin talks about our faces as mammals and how those faces show emotions, there are pictures of like monkeys doing all 3 of those things. So there's the chatter, there's the scream, so there's like the chatter, there's the running and the screaming, and then there's the total shutdown. The other thing he does with that, and Phyllis had typed out a little bit about this, and I'd love Phyllis to maybe come onto this comment thread later and add more about her experience as a vocal coach. But he talks about how your vocal cords will show those things, or your vocal nervous system, I guess. And so he says that, you know, your face is activated to do all of these things. So the first response would be to use our voices. The second response would be, you know, I guess to like scream. And then the third response would be to completely shut down and to freeze. And Phyllis had mentioned um, that she's seen this with like stage fright and things, and how doing some therapy over that has really been helpful to her as a vocal coach and as a performer. And I'd love to hear more about that. All right. I thought this was interesting. He talks about how people can get stuck in those phases when they're traumatized too. Like they so if that social talking through things didn't work, and you're traumatized, then a lot of times people might rely either on fight or flight or shutting down, and people can actually show both of those things in different ways. So he says some people will tap into that fight or flight constantly, like being angry and yelling, because it makes them feel energized. But under normal circumstances, so you think of like yelling at your kids or yelling at your spouse or yelling at your coworkers. Um, and I think that we might be seeing a lot of that now, because I'll be honest, like my reaction to the trauma that we're in now is I get really unhinged and angry about things that I otherwise would probably be able to like take a deep breath about. I was on a real confession time. I was on a clergy call today, and there were some things about it that upset me a little bit. And so I was like typing to a friend, and I went back and reread some of the things that I typed, and I was like, holy crap, Michelle, like chill out. This is not you. But I wasn't in danger because of any of those conversations. I was just frustrated. And that was what I was, how I was reacting. Um, but when he says, when we truly face a dangerous, so actual danger might make us do that, but we might go numb in other situations like birthday parties and stuff like that, which again would be an interesting thing to think about when we re-enter society. Are we gonna go numb when we're in big groups of people? All right. He continues to talk about being social. He continues to talk about how um, what how your body will take over with being frozen if you're not socially recognized or you're not able to flee. And then he starts to talk about treatment. And what I loved about what I really picked up on in his talk about treatment goes back again to that yelling thing. Like the yelling isn't going to work, right? So he says, for people who've been traumatized, when you yell at them, that's not going to do anything. They're just going to shut down. Um, and so you think about a child who is upset that did something wrong or got hurt, and they're just like crying and they're not making any sense. And then you yell at them like, "Why did you do that?" or "What happened?" They're not going to respond to that. They're just going to shut down more. They're either going to cry more, or they're just going to clam up, or they're going to run away and hide. And so he begins to talk about how what we really need is what can work is therapies that help people to interact with other people socially, where the bar is kind of set low at the beginning, or to put it another way, the interactions at the beginning are pretty minimal, and you kind of wean into it to show that you are safe. He says that doing physical things often helps with that. So he says, like playing ball or doing physical activities with other people where the interaction isn't so much about cognitive exchanges and social exchanges as it is just about physical things, which is why he says it's so important that we don't take physical things like PE and recess and chorus and band and all that stuff away from children within schools. And having been a former teacher, I couldn't agree with that more. Like the way that you help kids who are struggling is not to take away their recess and punish them. So that would be interesting to look at some more as we re-enter society. Is do we re-enter our world by just like being together a little bit before we have a lot of conversations? All right. In chapter 6, losing your body, losing yourself, this is where he talks about people who are numb might hurt themselves in order to feel something. So he talks about this patient he had who used to pick at herself, and she didn't experience any kind of like um, let me back up. She experienced trauma as a child, but it wasn't physical trauma. It was emotional trauma. It was emotional abuse. And her response to that as an adult has just been to pick, 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 pick until she bleeds. And I have seen that before. Yeah, someone I love like a more distant family member that was that family member's response to some pretty extreme trauma that that person couldn't control was just to pick. And so he talks about this is where cutting comes in. This is where drugs come in, and people might respond in different ways when they're numb so that they feel something and they can control what they feel. And he says what was very interesting with this patient is there were other things that she couldn't feel at all. So he talks about putting her on a massage table, having her close her eyes and then feeling her feet, and she couldn't feel it. So he he said you know you have to be able you have to help these folks begin to feel again and to do so safely. Um, Pretty interestingly, he shows these brain, well, there we go, diagrams, and he talks about how people who are in a resting state, who are not traumatized, have this this part of their brain that just lights up here. And it's your sense of self. It's to give you a sense of spatial awareness and a sense of where you are and who you are. And lots of different things will light up in the brain in a resting state. But people who have been traumatized, it's like almost dark. The only thing that's really lit up is just a little bit of awareness of where you are, little spatial awareness, but not too much. Yeah, so you feel like not alive. And he said that it's a protective thing. So even in a resting state, these people will just shut off all feelings, and it's a way to protect themselves, but they're essentially dead to the world. All right. Rhonda says we're all in danger more than we are conscious of, and we don't even know the things that we'll be losing. It's a big threat to our society. I find I'm not always aware of my feelings. What about children? Fear for the world that they're growing up in. Diane says depression is something that will be more prevalent in the US even as we enter into society again, or in us. Yeah, totally. Then he goes on to talk a lot about agency and how agency is like owning who we are and knowing that other people own who they are as well, and being aware of that, like being aware that I'm in control of myself and you're in control of yourself. And he said that people who've been traumatized often don't have as much agency because they just ignore their gut. So in other words, they because they've had so many emotional responses and so much danger and so much like hypersensitivity and fear and danger, that in order to control that, they'll just ignore everything. And so when they actually are in danger and their gut is saying or should be saying danger, 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 they ignore that and they're just totally unaware of what's going on. And he said the other thing is that some people, their body's response to that, instead of numbness, might actually be to have like a panic attack or something like that, or asthma flare ups. Rhonda says the whole thing about sense of self and where we experience that in our brains, it's amazing, and it helps me suspend judgment for people who are struggling. Yeah, this book has so helped me in the way that I have way overjudged some people and people I know who've been through trauma that I'm just like, dude, get it together. Um, Maybe people can't get it together without extreme therapy, without that three-pronged approach, sometimes medicine, sometimes talk therapy, and body movement. All those things working together will help them. But that's hard to find that balance. So anyway, back to the ways your body can respond. I worked with a little boy who, whenever he would do like math or something that really was a struggle for him, or things that he didn't enjoy, or things that made him increase his anxiety, he would have a panic attack and they'd be bad. I mean, just that, and he could make himself almost like black out, and that's what the author is saying can happen. And it can also trigger migraines, which I thought was super interesting, because I feel like a lot of people I know, and I'm not making a blanket generalized statement, people just suffer from migraines. But I also know, and people just suffer from asthma. But there are other people who have had a lot of trauma who I've noticed as I think about it, seem to suffer more from migraines and things like that. So it's interesting. Um, and then the last things he talks about are a word I can't pronounce, which is a Greek word for no words or feelings when you just can't express it at all. So people's response to anything is just like, I don't know, I can't describe it, can't explain it, don't have a reaction to it. I'm just blank. Um, but still, because the body needs to do something, because the body keeps the score, those folks might have bowel problems or have other like body symptoms that are inexplicable. And then finally, there's the depersonalization or losing your sense of self. So losing your agency, losing your sense of self. And he goes back to that car accident a couple of chapters ago when the same couple experienced the same car accident. And one of them responds with like night sweats and reliving the trauma. And the other one just can't remember a thing and has completely blanked out. And he says that that's something that can happen as well. And that some people can actually become so detached from themselves that it's like a phantom existence, where they actually like see things but aren't totally aware of them and kind of feel like they're floating outside of their body. Um, so to end it all, he says the most important thing is to help people who have experienced trauma to feel their body again, to befriend their body. So they have to trust their body and eventually trust other people too. So people need to be aware of their sensations, be open to feeling, and then help their body to interact with the world around them. Um, Sorry, I missed a couple people's notes, so I'll go back to those. But he says that that's the danger of medications, or it can be a potential danger of medications, is that when we give someone Western medicine, which is, he's not saying don't do it, but if it's not the right treatment, or those people haven't dealt with their emotions, or they don't want to feel, or the dosage is too high, or whatever, people might actually just blunt off all of their sensations and never really be able to resolve them, and never be able to turn their body feelings into an ally instead of something toxic. Um, so he says, the work of helpers is to help people be able to realign themselves, to help people be able to slowly reconnect with themselves and with others. Yeah, and then he kind of ends with the example of people who've been traumatized. One of the ways that we know that they struggle to connect with people is like eye contact. So there was this experiment where someone like had this hologram that they looked at, and it's Richard Gere, which I'm gonna be honest, like, Pretty Woman, it's awesome. It's a great movie. Now, Richard Gere is not quite like my generation, so if Richard Gere walked up to me, like, whatever. But, so take your pick of like your celebrity that you should be like, wow, he or she's in front of me. And this trauma victim just like looked down, didn't engage, couldn't care. Um, and that person's brain just wasn't, it just went into survival mode instead of like looking and saying, oh, this is Richard Gere coming up to me, like this is super fascinating, maybe I should ask him a question, maybe I should get his autograph. He's trustworthy, right? That's not what happens with that person. Instead, nothing activates. They're not curious, don't care, no eye contact. So he says in order to have genuine relationships with people, you have to be able to make that connection that we talked about earlier. You have to be able to look up and hold that person's gaze and assess for yourself. Are they a danger to me? Are they a support to me? Are they friendly? Are they okay? Are they safe? Do they want to engage me? Do they want to talk to me? And that's something that trauma victims need to be able to do, but often cannot do. All right, going to some of your comments and that are here and that I missed. Eleanor was talking about to feel close to people, that defense mechanism. So right there with Richard Gere or whomever, it has to kind of shut down. You have to be able to trust. which again is what Beth was talking about. You have to be able to trust people. So you have to be able to recognize, when do I let my walls down a little bit? And that's hard when you've been hurt and wounded. It's not easy work, and it's not work to be taken lightly, especially for people who've been really, really hurt. Phyllis recommends on page 94, looking at the work that was recommended there. And Phyllis talks about Moshe building Grace. I cannot say that. Phyllis, I'll type it in later. You can tell us some more about the body work that was done there and how fascinating and helpful that is. And then Rhonda is talking about mindfulness being critical. So getting in touch with your body, getting in touch with your breathing, all of those things help people to get in touch with themselves again, and how that's really important. I'm super looking forward to closer to the end of the book when he keeps telling us, I'll get to that, I'll get to that. Chapter 16, I'll get to that, where we get to learn some more of these techniques. Yeah. So I have rambled for like a super long time. One day we'll get more organized with this. I just found it really fascinating, and I'm glad that you did too. I think the takeaway questions today would be, there again, kind of the same ones as last time. How do we engage this with the trauma that we're all in collectively? How are we going to be able to re-enter society and give ourselves grace to do it? What tools can this book give us to help us to re-enter physical society together when we can physically be present with one another? And 3, how can this help you? You can answer this here, maybe you just answer this for yourself. How can this book and this work help you to relinquish some of that judgment that maybe you have felt for people who've been through a lot of trauma and the way they handle that? And you might even be answering that question for yourself. So what is some judgment that you can relinquish, and what tools do you now have in helping that person? Or maybe you're not their helper, but maybe you are just in relationship with them. So how can you be in better relationship, a more understanding relationship with that person, whether it's someone or whether it's yourself? So, all right. We'll see you on Thursday, and we're going to aim more for 5 o'clock on Thursday. And we'll be going into the minds of children, 7 and 8. So if you've had a really traumatic childhood, or if stories of children are really hard for you, you might want to be gentle with yourself as you read this and give yourself permission to back off of this part if you need to. But if that's something that's really fascinating to you and you work with children, then I hope that you will come with lots of feedback and questions for us. I will certainly be gentle with myself going into the next part, because I love the babies. So, all right, friends. Yes, Diane, I'll send the questions. Let me remember what I asked, and I will post them. Have a wonderful day, everybody, and keep dumping your questions and your thoughts about these 2 chapters here, and I'll talk to you later.